So in Luke chapter 7, this is a continuation from last week. So if you were here last week, we asked the question, who is Jesus? And we all know the church answer that we're supposed to give. We all know the Bible answer. But the question that I asked last week and I want to continue asking today is, to you personally, who is Jesus? How would you answer that in your own life? And if we went around the room, I bet all of our answers would be a little bit different of what Jesus means to us, who Jesus is. I think we'd have a lot of the same things. But you might be here today, and I ask you, who is Jesus to you? And you might not be sure. You might have an answer as, I'm still trying to figure that out. And you're at the perfect, if that's your answer, you're at the perfect place. We're going to look at one of the great stories in the book of Luke. We're going to be in chapter 36. As we read this story, think about, who is Jesus? What do we find out about Jesus in this story? So Luke chapter 7, verse 36. When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. Now, this is not my favorite way to eat dinner. I'm going to be honest with you. Has anybody ever eaten dinner reclining? I would get choked up if I tried that. But this is what they did in their culture. They actually laid down and reclined while they ate dinner. They didn't sit in chairs like we do today. So to us, that would look really strange, but that's what they did. Now, who is Simon here? He is a Pharisee. This is so fascinating. Because if you remember the story that we looked at last week, right before this, Jesus didn't have some positive things to say about Pharisees, did he? And if you know the Gospels, the Pharisees are one of the biggest enemies that Jesus has. The Pharisees contribute to the arrest and execution of Jesus. They're kind of the ones that lead the charge to get everybody mad at Jesus. And there are very, very few Pharisees who are fans of Jesus. I mean, we know about one. There's a guy named Nicodemus, but he's so scared, he doesn't tell anybody that he believes in Jesus. But remember what Jesus said last week about the Pharisees? He said, the Pharisees are rejecting me. Why? Because they first rejected John the Baptist. So John the Baptist came to pave the way for God, for Jesus. That's what we read last week. And the Pharisees, remember, the Pharisees are the most respected religious people of the day. They were the pastors, they were the preachers, they were the people, the most highly religious, educated people in the land. They were the most respected. And yet, they rejected the preaching of John the Baptist, his call to repentance. And because they rejected that, they were now rejecting Jesus as well. So they were at the top, and now they're finding themselves at the bottom. While those who were really considered the worst people in the land, I mean, they were the worst people in Israel, they had the worst reputations, they had responded to the message of John the Baptist. They had responded to him. They had repented. They had been baptized. And now they are the ones following Jesus. And now they find themselves not at the bottom, but in the eyes of God at the top. There's a whole reversal of things going on here. Now, who is Simon? Which side is Simon on? Why is Simon, this Pharisee, inviting Jesus to his home? This is a very interesting situation. We know some of the Pharisees are trying to trap Jesus. Is that what he's doing? Is he trying to find something that he can take back to Jerusalem and say, I've figured out how we can get Jesus arrested? Or does Simon have good motivations? Is he actually trying to learn about Jesus? Is he trying to figure out who is Jesus? Maybe he's asking that question. Maybe he's seen Jesus do some miracles. He's okay, is Jesus really a prophet or even more than a prophet? Well, let's not judge Simon here. Let's give him the benefit of the doubt and say maybe he's got an open mind and he wants to learn about Jesus. So he's invited Jesus to his home. Jesus has accepted. Well, let's look at the very next verse, verse 37. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life. Raise your hand if that's you. No, don't raise your hand. This is Luke is being polite here by not listing out the sins of this lady. There's a lady in that town, and she has the worst reputation. And Luke is being polite. He knows there's going to be adolescent ears in the audience. So he just says, she's lived a sinful life. So, if you were to meet her, walking down the street and say, hey, what have you been up to the last couple years? She'd say, sin. Don't ever say that. If somebody, you haven't seen a friend in a long time, hey, what's been going on? Sin. Just a lot of sin. Don't say that, even if it's true. But that's what she would answer, because that has been the defining characteristic of her life, is absolute sin, and everybody knows it. Everybody knows her. She can't even pretend. She's been living a sinful life. But look what happens. She learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, so she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. Now, I remember Daryl telling me a story about, I think you were fixing the roof, and you had a friend or family member who was helping you fix the roof of this building. And you guys were here for a while during the day, and he refused to come into the building. He felt so guilty. I don't think he was a Christian, but he felt so guilty about his sin, he wouldn't even come through the doors inside the building. He helped fix the outside, but he wouldn't come in here because of his guilt. Well, think about this lady. This lady, everybody knows who she is. She is going to go into this Pharisee's home. She knows the looks she's going to get from people just walking in the door. She knows what they are going to say to her. She knows what they're going to mutter under their breath as they point at her. She knows these things, and yet she still goes in. What we find out is she has just recently become a woman of courage, willing to face all of this. And you have to ask the question, why? Why would she do that? And we're about to find the answer. Look at verse 38. As she stood behind him, Jesus, at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. All right, let's stop here. Let's be honest. This is pretty gross. Just being honest. For some people, this is their actual worst nightmare. Anything involving feet at all is, I've met people that this would be the worst punishment you could ever give them. But it's actually worse than what you're even imagining. So let's put ourselves back in the first century. What is the state of Jesus' feet at this moment? Probably not good. Has he been wearing boots all day? Probably not. I believe the fashion of that time period was sandals. Probably had been wearing sandals all day in the hot, dusty roads. Was he wearing socks? Well, he's not German, so probably not wearing socks with the sandals. Probably had some sweaty, terrible feet. He might have been walking where the donkeys had tread, if you know what I mean. The feet of Jesus are not a pretty sight at this moment. And this woman, she comes and she starts kissing his feet. I tried to kiss Kristen's foot once and she kicked me. There's no way to exaggerate how awkward this situation is. I tried to make it a little bit awkward for us. This is so awkward. It's even more awkward than if it happened today. I mean, imagine yourself in the room. And this lady comes in and she's humiliating herself. This is an act of humiliation. She is humbling herself to Jesus. She doesn't care about the rest of the people there. She doesn't even care about them. She is there for Jesus. She's humbling herself. She's humiliating herself. And she is weeping. Why? Well, if you've ever come to Jesus at your absolute lowest moment in life, I think you understand. I think you know exactly what she's thinking and what she's feeling here. I remember the moment that I stood up to get baptized. When I responded to the invitation song, and I was okay until I stood up. And when I stood up, I lost it. I started bawling uncontrollably. It was ugly. And I couldn't, I don't know where it came from, but I was coming to bring all of my sin to Jesus. And I wept. That's where this lady is at. And she is kissing the feet of Jesus as if she just woke up from a coma. As if she had just come from death to life. And that might be an accurate description. Because I'm guessing, this is just a guess, but I'm guessing that she had just gotten baptized. And you'll see why here in a second. But that's just a guess. But this went on here. What she's doing, this was not a 10-second little episode here. This went on for minutes. Her tears, she's kissing his feet. And everything that she does here would have been considered inappropriate in their culture. Even more so than today. As awkward and as weird as that would be today, it was even worse back then. Everything she did was inappropriate. The fact that she let down, you would have heard people gasping. People would have covered their mouths in shock. When she let down her hair in public, if Simon had a wife, she probably would have fainted from the horror. Everything she's doing, you're not supposed to do. And yet here she is. And it went on. And you're wondering, what is Jesus thinking right now? What is everybody else thinking right now? Well, look at verse 39. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of a woman she is, that she is a sinner. Now remember, when Simon is using this word sinner, he doesn't use it the way that we do, right? When we say sinner, we're just talking about every human in the world who's ever sinned, which is all of us. When he says sinner, he's talking about an Israelite who has rejected God. He's talking about an Israelite who has said, I will no longer follow the law. I am rejecting the law. I am rejecting God. I'm doing my own thing. That was a sinner. And in Simon's mind, she's as good as a pagan. She is not in God's family anymore. She's not in God's people anymore. She's been cast out. In Simon's mind, that's who has just come into his home. And he's thinking, and he's asking the question, who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? Well, and Simon says, well, you must not be a prophet. No self-respecting, righteous man of God would allow this to happen. Right? Am I right? No? Well, look what happens. Verse 40. Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to tell you. Well, Simon's in trouble. If Jesus were a prophet, he might also know what Simon had just been thinking about. Well, Simon says, tell me, teacher, he said. In verse 41, this is Jesus speaking. 2 people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii. That's a measurement of money. And the other 50. So you got two people. One owes him a little bit of money. One owes him a giant amount of money. Neither of them, verse 42, had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now, which one of them will love him more? Verse 43, Simon replied, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. You have judged correctly, Jesus said. Then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? That's kind of funny, right? Do you see this woman? And Simon's thinking, how could I not see her? Everybody sees her. He's thinking, Jesus, this is the worst thing that's ever happened in my home because of her. Yes, I see her. And Jesus is going to say, no, you don't. I'm asking you, do you know why she's here? Do you see the motivation that she has in her heart? Obviously, Simon has judged her. And Jesus says, do you see what's going on in her heart? Do you know why she's here? So Jesus says, let me explain it to you. And look what Jesus says. I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, which was that's a customary greeting. They, kind of like Italians. But this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. What's Jesus saying here? Has Simon showed any respect to Jesus? Simon invited Jesus into his home. Has Simon done anything to show any kind of respect to Jesus? The answer is no. In fact, looks like some disrespect might be happening compared to this lady. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little, loves little. Then Jesus said to her, your sins are forgiven. This is a teaching that all of us need to think about. All of us need to spend time contemplating what Jesus has just said here. Jesus is saying that the love that you show God throughout the week, throughout your life, the love that you show God is going to be in proportion to the debt that you used to owe God. And so what Jesus is saying here, he's saying that our sin causes a debt that we owe to God. And to have our sin forgiven is to have that debt canceled. And so Jesus says, think about your love for God. Think about how much you love God. Think about how you devote your life to God. What motivates you? That is going to be in proportion to the debt of sin that has been forgiven to you. Now, this is the point that Simon has completely missed, and that we really need to wrap our minds around. Was Simon's debt of sin more or less than this lady's debt of sin? Well, it depends who you asked. It depends who you ask. If you ask Simon, what would he say? Simon would say, oh, my debt of sin is so much less. In that story, I'm the 50 denarii guy. And this lady, she might be 500, but compared to me, she's more like 5 million. How much her debt of sin. I don't think Simon would have said he was sinless, but he would have said, I'm the 50 and she's the 500. But what if you ask Jesus? You say, Jesus, who has sinned more? What is the debt of sin? Is Simon's debt of sin more or less than this lady's? How do they compare? What would Jesus say? I think Jesus would say, They both are going to cost me my life. In the eyes of God, their debt is the same. And that's what Simon had missed. And that's what's easy for us to miss today. That we're like Simon and we think, I'm a pretty good person. I'm a decent person. My debt of sin isn't that much compared to some people. When all the while Jesus is saying, it cost me my life. What are you talking about? It's the same debt. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, do we truly understand the debt that Jesus paid for us on the cross? Do we understand it? And you might say, yeah, of course. But where's the proof? Where's the proof? Jesus says, we'll see it by the way that you love God. So maybe the better question is, how much do you love Jesus? That's going to tell the story, isn't it? That's going to tell the story. Now, this lady here who comes to Jesus, she's amazing. She is remarkable. She goes from being an unmentionable word in that town to being a model for us to imitate. How does that happen? Something like that only happens in Jesus. Only God can do something like that. And think of the love that she is showing Jesus right now. I mean, it honestly, for me to picture it in my mind it's a little uncomfortable for me to even think about or talk about. But her unhindered love for Jesus, her unashamed love for Jesus, it's a picture of worship. It is a model for us to imitate. And Jesus, rather than being embarrassed by this display of love, Jesus is honored by her love. And what doesn't get told in this story about her, but it has to be true. It just has to be true. What did it take for her to get to this moment? If she had been living a sinful life in complete rebellion to God, how did she get to this moment? She had to take some pretty giant steps of faith. She had to swallow her pride and say, I was wrong. I've been living wrong. She had to humble herself before she even came to Jesus here. She had to humble herself. She had to look at her shame. How many people won't even admit their shame? She looked at her shame square in the eyes and had to give it to God to come to this moment. And what doesn't get told in this story, but what had to be true. How many broken relationships did she have in her life? How many members of her family, her neighbors, her friends had she hurt? And now she's got to go back to them and start fixing what she broke. How many people had she lied to? How many people had she manipulated? Had she used to get what she wanted? And now she's got to go back to them and say to them, I was wrong. I have sinned against you. And she had to repent. She's going to have to swallow her pride day after day, fixing up the broken pieces that she shattered of these relationships to be the child of God that she was now going to be. The child of God that God was calling her to be. What a woman of courage. What a woman of faith for us to imitate. So you ask the question, who's Jesus? Who is Jesus? She knows. She knows the answer. But the rest of the people there, not so much. Look at verse 49. The other guests began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? Because in their minds, only God can forgive sins, which is true. They're not wrong. So who is Jesus who can forgive sins? Jesus said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Now for me, this is the most shocking part of the whole chapter. I read what Jesus just says here. Your faith has saved you. And I'm thinking, what? I've been taught I'm not allowed to think that way. That I have no involvement in my salvation at all. But Jesus says, your faith has saved you. And I'm going to be honest with you, I'm still kind of processing this. I'm still trying to grasp this is incredible. What is Jesus talking about here? I'm going to tell you, I'm going to admit, people have wildly different interpretations of this, wildly different opinions. I'm going to tell you how I see it, what I'm reading. What I think Jesus is saying is that Jesus will not save you against your will. He won't do it. If you are dead set on living in rebellion against God, He's going to let you do that. If you want to be saved, you have to come to Jesus in faith, just like this lady. You have to. You have to, what she does here is an act of love, but it's also an act of faith. That's why I think she had just gotten baptized. She had been forgiven. And so if we want to come to Jesus, we also have to do these acts of faith. We talk about repentance, about changing from our old life, about rejecting our old life in rebellion and coming to Jesus, about getting baptized, being united with Jesus in His death and resurrection. Those are acts of faith. But it doesn't stop there. Jesus says that we have to pick up our cross and follow Him. That is an act of faith. And for the rest of our lives, we will be taking steps of faith, acts of faith towards Jesus. And I think what Jesus is saying is, we're going to do this together. Jesus says it's going to be my power and it's going to be your faith, but we're going to do this together. We've been looking through the book of Revelation. What's amazing is that Jesus, this is a paraphrase, but Jesus says, I'm not going to save this world by myself. I'm going to use you. I'm going to use your faith, in fact. And together, we're going to save this world. That Jesus wants to partner with us in His fight against the evil one. Jesus wants to partner with us to bring the lost into God's family. Jesus doesn't want to do this by Himself. He wants to partner with us. And I think that is what's going on right here. It's our faith and it's His power. Now, can we do it without His power? Nope, can't do it. If it's our faith and His power, do we get half the credit? No, it's still all His credit. It's still all His power, all His glory. Without Him, we're nothing. We still don't get any credit. It's still His. But it's an act of grace and it's an act of love that Jesus would even use us to accomplish His will. I think that's what's going on here. So who is Jesus to you? Well, maybe you're here today and you're kind of like this Pharisee named Simon. You think I'm a pretty good person. I haven't done a whole lot of wrong, compared to those guys over there. I'm pretty decent. Well, you're doing it wrong if that is your line of thinking. You need to ask God to open your eyes to understand the debt that you used to owe God. Well, maybe you're here today and you're more like this lady in the past that she used to have. There's great news for you. Such good news for you. Jesus wants you to come to Him. Jesus wants you to join His family. He wants you to come to Him. He knows your past. He knows every terrible thought you've had. He knows every terrible thought that you've done, but He also knows it about me. And He wants us to come to Him in faith. And the great thing about Jesus is He loves you just the way you are, but He loves you so much He won't let you stay that way. Only in Jesus can you be made new. Only in Jesus can you find forgiveness. Only in Jesus can you find a purpose and a meaning for your life. Without Jesus, there is no meaning in this life. But in Jesus, there is meaning and purpose. And Jesus can give that to you. And only in Jesus does death not have the final say. Where else could you go? Where else could you go? So who is Jesus to you? If you need to answer that question today, we're going to offer an invitation. And you can come forward as we stand and sing.